Alright, well, I was 2 pages in before I realized I wasn't recording. So here we go again. Mr. Evans took only about 2 minutes to reach her from the moment when he first came round the corner. But during those 2 moments, Miss Crow had experienced the eternal alternations, the great antipodal feelings of human experience, the shudder of death, and the pleasure which there is in life itself. And she was a woman to miss little, though she kept her own counsel of these experiences. She thought to herself, "There's the man Evans coming. I'll get him to send me that St. Augustine Sam talked about. And I'll give it to Matt. I can afford that now." How fast the mind moves, from margin to margin of these opposite feelings. Mr. Evans was rapidly coming to a point within hearing, and if she wanted to speak to him about St. Augustine, she would have to stop him. And yet behind Mr. Evans's approaching figure, and behind the image of the expensive book, and even behind the image of Matt Decker's pleasure in the book, that cold, shuddering recoil still possessed her. And that magical light flickering on the poplar tree still possessed her. The invisible watchers, those scientific collectors of interesting human experiences in this ancient town, communicated to one another the conclusion that certain essences and revelations are caught and appropriated by an old maiden lady like Miss Crow, which are never touched by turbulent, tormented lives like those of Mr. Evans and Codfin. How could Mr. Evans, now lifting his hat to greet this dignified figure of voluminous skirts and flounced bosom, become a medium for these calm platonic essences? What could Codfin, who was risking the hangman's rope for the sake of the mania of a madwoman, know of the deep natural shrinking of a normal heart in the presence of death, or of its rapturous awareness of the enchantment of what it is leaving? Miss Crow had arranged to meet Lady Rachel and Atheling for lunch at the Pilgrimses that day. She was a little nervous in her heart of hearts about this encounter, because in her growing disapproval, shared it may well be imagined by the girl's father, of the intimacy in which the lovers now seemed to be living, she had of late avoided seeing Ned Atheling. Rachel still officially lived with her, but there had been whole nights when the girl had remained working, or so she declared, in the offices of the Wayfarer. And gossip had already begun to speak on the prolonged visits she paid to the bachelor's attic, which the young editor had furnished for himself above these offices. I think that's as far as I got last time. It took me longer. Lord P. had recently several grave and diplomatic talks with Miss Crow as to what measures they could take to stop the outbreak of a serious scandal. But neither she nor he had yet dared to risk any drastic ultimatum to the willful girl for fear of precipitating the very disaster they dreaded. That's as far as I got. Okay. "I shan't stay long after lunch," Miss Crow thought, as she responded to the salute of Mr. Evans. "And I won't go to their printing place with them today. I'll get them to leave me free for the afternoon, and I'll go to Wirral Hill, if I am not too exhausted, and sit on the seat where Matt and I used to sit 30 years ago." She beckoned now to Mr. Evans, and he came up to where she was and stood in front of her. There was something about Miss Crow, her devout mother perhaps, that commanded more respect from the Glastonbury tradesmen than any other person in the town. Mr. Evans, though certainly not a tradesman, was not insensible to this quality, and he stood awkwardly now, but quite deferentially, waiting what she had to say. "You've got rather an expensive edition of St. Augustine among your books, haven't you, Mr. Evans?" she said quietly. "Yes, ma'am," admitted number two's partner. "The best on the market." It is an odd and bitter experience of the human race that when once a Gulf Stream of a particularly evil has got started, it is always being whipped forward by some new little breeze, or enlarged by some new little stream emptying itself into it. The magnetic power, it seems, is such a Gulf Stream of evil, attracts these casual and accidental encouragements. Why, of all things, should Mr. Evans have been reminded of their collection of books at this juncture, and why, of all their books, of the particular one that was a neighbor to the unpardonable sin? "I think, if your partner has not sold it yet," said Miss Crow, "I'd like to have that book." "I'll put it aside for you, ma'am," murmured Mr. Evans. "It is expensive, I'm afraid, but if—" "It'll be extravagant for once," cried the lady with a smile. "So I think you can send it today if you've got anyone to send. You know my number in Benedict Street." Mr. Evans bowed. Oh, there goes my bookmark. Mr. Evans bowed. Everyone knew Miss Crow's number. Hadn't it been the chief topic of the town when she left her nephew's establishment and went to live in a workman's cottage? I don't know. "I hope Mrs. Evans is well?" inquired the lady. This simple question caused the brain of the hook-nosed man, bending towards her, to whirl up in an angry revolt against the smoothed-out pigeonhole of public propriety in which a married tradesman lived. It rose to the tip of his tongue, in his nervous state, to ask this quiet embodiment of conventional dignity some outrageous question in return, such as, "How does your Tossie feel married to Mr. Barter?" Or, "How will you manage about the way Lady Rachel is carrying on with the young Atheling?" "Very well, ma'am, thank you," he replied. And then he even took upon himself to add, "We've got a house that's quite easy for her to look after." Miss Crow smiled. "I'm glad to hear that. It's a mistake for a young married woman to be overworked." She made a little movement, then, with the handle of her umbrella, to signify that she had no further need for Mr. Evans' society. The Welshman straightened his back, bowed to her in a manner that even Mrs. Gurd could not have felt disgraced the house of Rise, and went off, settling his hat upon his head as he went, in little angry jerks, and vowing that he would not remove it again till he reached his destination. He was hardly gone, for Miss Crow had selected a very public place for her matutinal rest. Matutinal? M-A-T-U-T-I-N-A-L. I don't know what that word is. Rest. Then Comrade Trent, as the populace in their mocking rustic humor always called him, came softly and airily by. Miss Elizabeth only just knew Paul Trent to speak to, as they say, and she was cordially prejudiced against the man. She had long ago put down in her heart this whole wretched business of the new regime to this alien from the Scilly Isles. It was clearly he who had devised the scheme of buying the leases and the ground rents from the lord of the manor and doing out, in this pauperizing manner, all that the visitors brought in among the town's poor. Neither honest Dave nor that hot-headed agitator Robinson, and certainly not Mr. Gurd, with his fancies, would have had the wit to plot such a daring move. Miss Elizabeth had scant admiration for her nephew Philip, but she felt sorry for him and even sympathetic with him when she beheld this affected, sly young lawyer prancing about the town as if he were the master of all. In the relations between human beings, it is always natural to attribute the grossest, selfish motives to the people who we instinctively dislike. Of the real Paul Trent, who inherited from his mother an idealism passionate as that of the poet Shelley, and who would have perished willingly on a barricade if he could have started an anarchistic revolution. Miss Crow knew absolutely nothing. "Good morning, Miss Crow," said Paul Trent. "Enjoying this beautiful weather?" "Au contraire, Mr. Trent. I'm doing my accounts. Before plunging into wallops, you know, a woman has to think out what she can afford without ruining herself. I always slip off in the middle of my shopping day to do a little solitary thinking." This allusion to wallops was a covert feminine taunt at this arrogant young man, for it was well known in the town that Mr. Wallop owned his shop at the ground, and it stood on in a fee. Mr. Wallop owned his shop, and the ground it stood on in fee simple. Wallops, like the Glastonbury Bank, remained an obstinate island of capitalism in a socialistic lake. "What a treasure your Mr. Wallop is," murmured Paul Trent. And taking advantage of this faint crack in the ice, like a cat rubbing itself against the knees of someone who hates cats, he proceeded to slip down into the seat at her side. "How do you like our new Glastonbury Constitution?" he asked her in an airy tone. "I don't meddle with politics, sir," she replied, and the way she moved away from him as she spoke seemed to add, "and I can't abide politicians." "I agree with you entirely," he said, and then, to Miss Crow's horror, he pulled up one of his soft, neatly socked legs upon the seat between them and slipped his arm along the back of the bench. "I'll get up in a minute. My heart stops thumping," the lady thought. "What does this objectionable young man want with me?" "A woman like you, Miss Crow," he went on, with what she thought was pure impertinence, "can understand better what I am doing in Glastonbury than the most intelligent man could." Miss Crow tapped the ground with her umbrella. Then she produced a clicking noise between her tongue and her teeth. And having expressed with these physical movements her disapproval of Paul Trent, she made her mock-modest retort to his ambiguous compliment by uttering the syllables "ta-ta-ta-ta." But her insidious invader only pulled his rounded feminine knee and his neatly trussed calf a little further along the seat of the bench, and slid his delicately molded hand an inch nearer along its back, till the scrupulously clean nail of his little finger was within the length of a sparrow's beak of Miss Crow's jacket collar. These outward gestures, which gave his companion a tickling sensation down her spine, were methods of approaching inherited from his father, a Cornishman who had the suavidity of some old Phoenician trader. But below all this, there stirred in Paul Trent an intense idealistic longing, inherited from his mother, to convert Miss Crow to his revolutionary ideas. "I'm very serious, lady," he said. "You mustn't get cross with me. There really aren't so many women one can talk to in Glastonbury. Most of my thoughts are entirely wasted on these people. This nice unusual day seems to make you moralize, Mr. Trent, just as it makes me sit in the sun and wonder about my bills. What I've found out is," he went on eagerly, quite oblivious of this snub, "that none of these people, what you quite properly call politicians, Miss Crow, know what liberty is. The capitalists take liberty away from us in the name of liberty, which, under them, means liberty to work like a slave or to starve. But your relative, Mr. Spear, isn't much better. He takes liberty away from the individual in the name of the community. So there you are, you see. I am probably the only man in Glastonbury who fights for real liberty, which means, of course, a voluntary association of free spirits to enjoy the ideal life. But women understand these things much better. It was my mother who..." Miss Crow looked at him with surprise. There had stolen into his affectedly genteel intonation a vibration of such authentic emotion that it startled her. She didn't repeat the clicking of her tongue. She allowed her umbrella to lie still, its handle between her knees, She forgot the sinister palpitations of her heart. Your mother who? Who taught me what liberty really meant. Who made me an anarchist, lady. Well, we'll leave it at that. This Glastonbury is brought to you by the Block Island Ferry. Come with me to Block Island. Take a trip back to carefree times. Leave today, Block Island is waiting. Just leave your troubles behind. I can't really see it. There you go. Well, until next time, I'll see you in Glastonbury. Toodles.